Hello everyone, hope you're doing well today. This video may be a bit different from the usual output, but I was inspired to speak about it, and you have to run with inspiration when it comes, I think. And it all started with a memory where I remember watching this modern art exhibit where a guy was wearing a pig's head and smothering himself nude in tomato ketchup and mayonnaise while pretending to masturbate, essentially. Pretty disgusting, right? Pretty typical of modern art. And I remember at the time, I was about 23, thinking, that's just disgusting. What does that even mean? But I was contemplating it the other morning, and I was thinking, I kind of get what it means. And a lot of art, I think, it speaks to something deeper than often the artist understands. And I thought all of this relates to, I think, what's happened in modernity. And this is why I want to speak a little bit about the liberal boomer and the mangled millennial. Now, I know a few boomers have reached out to me and said, stop giving us stick and all that. I think you can take it as read. I don't mean boomers wholesale. I know there are some good boomers who saw what was coming in the decline and corruption of the Western way and the religious way, or even the traditional way, or even just the old way. And they did try and speak out about it. I get that. But I must say, I'm not even blaming the liberal boomers here necessarily, because properly understood, they were the first generation who suffered the mass spiritual and cultural revolution that we're now reeling from. We're now only just figuring out. And you could say even their parents before them, the sort of broken war generation, were so traumatized and hammered, they just sort of let go of the structures that, if you like, held things together because they were so beaten down. And that led to this great explosion, if you like, which again, like all things, seems like gold and freedom when it first happens. But in time, you realize there's something dark smuggled in. I also think it's very important for all of us to be very wary of blaming your parents. And I think there can be an echo of that in some of the conversations around boomers. You'd have to be super careful of that. Blaming your parents is very, very unhealthy. It's not to say you're wrong to point out legitimate things about, when you were a child and you had no choice but to learn. And, that's all part of healthy self-evolution. I accept that. But simply just pointing your finger at your parents and blaming them is very, very bad for us psychologically and spiritually. I think Jung spoke about this. He said something along the lines of, when we do this, we mistake our parents for gods. I think that's a very good way of viewing it. And we almost stay eternal children, especially spiritually, because we're not really growing. It's why the men's teacher David Data once said, you must live as if your father's dead. He didn't mean that literally, you want your father to be dead. He meant you need to free your soul from under the imposition of the ideas you have of your father. Now again, this is all metaphorical and symbolic, of course, with regards to the growth of the soul. We do see this also mirrored in some of our traditional and cultural understanding. I'll speak to that later. But the point I want to get to here is the liberal boomer, really the life that we associate with the liberal boomer in their 20s, wasn't really as widespread as we often think about it. And that's because when we look back to the 60s and swing in London and smoking weed and LSD, this was actually, when you really look into it and speak to people from that era, quite a minor thing. This was in London, maybe a bit of it in Birmingham, in Manchester, in Glasgow. But broadly speaking, the most of the UK was still very traditional. So it was really just going on in the urban centres, in the music culture, in the arts. And of course, that's what's recorded culturally. So it gives us this sort of false idea that there was this wide-scale revolution. But in reality, that didn't really occur until the millennial generation. Gen X was something slightly different. Of course, the boomers at that point were just finding their feet in work. And Gen X came through, a slightly different generation. But by the time they had the millennials, that was when the 60s really came into fruition. And what I mean by that is children were raised with a sense of licentiousness that was just never before experienced. Further to that, as I pointed out, Freudian slip there, they were also fatherless, whether literally or metaphorically. Literally a lot of the time, because divorce became so prevalent, but also symbolically and metaphorically, because a lot of the fathers were either chasing the Thatcherite dream at that point of just money in the market, out at work all day, would only really identify with their children at the football, where they try and pass on these sort of old school values in a very sort of limited, shallow way. Or they were spiritually feminine by that point anyway, listen to sort of John Lennon and all the rest of it and thought, that stuff is toxic masculinity. We don't need any of that anymore. So it meant that a lot of youngsters just didn't really have any fatherly structure growing up, and a lot of licentiousness. And of course, I experienced this as a millennial myself. When you look back, it's crazy. By 12 years old, most of the kids are listening to hardcore rap. Eminem was coming out around then. MTV. You were fully up to date on ideas around sex. You were told that, being sexual for a woman is the best thing you can be. Men almost acting in this excessive sexual manner. I remember being driven to a party when I was 12 by one of my friend's mums, who was a bit more of a stern woman. And I remember her gasping at the sight of some of these 12-year-old girls that we were going to go and have this party with because they were wearing like short skirts. And I remember thinking, like, what a loser that woman is. Because that was the first time I'd seen anybody, sort of shocked by the sexual excess even going on amongst kids at that point. Now, of course, I completely understand and would agree with her. But back then, you have no reference in that in your life. I'm not to say there weren't one or two good parents out there, but I think broadly speaking, the licentiousness was feeding into a younger generation. Now, that's before you'd even really come of age, before teenagehood even started. And personally speaking for me, a big thing in my teenage years, and lots of my friends, was Nirvana. And we didn't really understand Nirvana. When you think back at what Nirvana is, it's a broken man who's deeply wounded, again, fatherless, can't get on with the mainstream West. In some reasons, you can sympathise with him for that. It's also fake. In another sense, it's because he's a bit of a broken guy himself. And most of his songs are just him screaming, painful screams into a microphone, which, of course, you don't understand when you're young. I just thought it was cool because, bashing drums and long hair and F the world and, just like rebellion. That's what I thought it was cool for. But as you grow, you realise that it's really tragic. Not only was this guy deeply wounded and addicted to drugs and broken inside and chasing toxic women, but he himself wanted to be known for being an artist who spoke to the corruption of the world, but was celebrated for the exact opposite, by naive teenagers. And then all of a sudden that was replaced by rap. Mass rap came on the scene. Again, it just upped the level of degeneracy. Endless talking about booty and booze and bitches and drugs and the rest of it that comes with it. And that instilled this sort of wigger idea that's still around today. You're only really masculine if you take and adopt the black culture. And I know it's easy to point and laugh at these people, but I've always sympathised with them because I experienced it growing up. I remember growing up in Leicester, you're kind of seen as boring white bread. There's nothing to you. There's no structure of masculinity. There's no initiation. There's no culture to move into. It's all just liberalism. So when you do get this rap culture, which again is allowed by the mainstream because it's black and they view blacks as minorities and henceforth they're victims, so they'll turn a blind eye to the excessive degeneracy and violence within that music that will essentially be taken on board by the younger whites because it's some form of identity. Of course, we see that across the board, especially in working class communities now. They're not playing Oasis anymore. They've all turned into basically counterfeit blacks because it gives them an identity. And it might be a counterfeit masculinity itself, again, because lots of the black community and rap comes from fatherless households, but it's something with aggression that they feel that can express a sort of testosterone in there. But again, the point is, as I say, this is something that you come across when you're extraordinarily young. A lot of my friends were very used to this stuff by 14, 15. And that's, again, across the board with millennials. Another thing that's across the board with millennials when you speak to them is the prevalence of drugs. Weed was extremely common, and strong weed. The skunk boom that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was no longer the harmless hash that our parents smoked in the 60s and thought that we were smoking. It was this super skunk stuff that drives you absolutely nuts. It might even be a gateway drug, but even the weed alone drove several people I knew mad, And again, this is where the difference came, where the 60s really came into their fruition. The boomers dabbled with drugs in London when they were 21, listening to the Rolling Stones. The millennials were hammering hardcore super skunk by 14, listening to the Wu-Tang Clan. It was a whole different energy. It had gone up several levels, and the boomers just didn't know this and wouldn't know what to say anyway, even if they did. So even in my school environment, people were smoking weed by 12, and I was in a middle class, middle of the middle, Heroin by 14. I remember a few lads in the town next to us were hooked on heroin at 14. And acid as well, people were taking. And everybody knows someone in the millennial generation who just got taken out by that. There's always one person, or sometimes more, 5 if you like, at your school or in your friendship group, who smoked loads of weed and just lost his mind. For me, it was very close to home. It was with my brother. He got into weed very young, was taking acid by 14, 15, and it was just gone. I mean, I remember he'd gone in his eyes. I mean, he stayed alive for a good 10 years after, but I could see in his eyes he'd gone. And I knew him probably better than anyone. It was scary. It was really scary. It was like a demon had come in. God bless him. God rest his soul. I don't say the demon is him. I'm saying you could see something had come in, and I was like, oh, this is not good. And the liberal boomers just don't know what to do, off to the psych wards. And with that, so even the religious people wouldn't know what to do. At this point, they're all softy Anglicans who are more similar to Richard Dawkins than Jesus Christ. Anyway, the point I'm making is this was an early, real battering of the millennial mind that came in. And as I say, very, very common. And this was followed, I remember in my upbringing, by a sort of pure nihilism that came in, well exemplified by the American movies, things like Road Trip, American Pie. This was the soft version of it, Blink 182. The idea being that your life is fun. It's not about really achieving anything, it's just about having fun. And that really reached its apex for me in the show Jackass. Some of you might remember this. It was a bunch of skateboarders. We were very into skateboarding, me and my friendship group, so Jackass was a natural thing to take an interest in. And Jackass was essentially apolitical, nihilistic carnage. It was just fun and pushing the boundary of acceptability, rebelling against mainstream society, wanting to be an eternal 14-year-old. Now, it seemed all very fun and clever at the time, and the people in Jackass made millions. But if you want to see the results, look at a guy called Bam Margera. He was like the star of Jackass, pro skateboarder. A lot of it revolved around him. His friend died in a high-speed accident. He was a member of Jackass as well. And then he's just basically an alcoholic wreck now. And he keeps trying to get into recovery but can't do it. And the harsh reality is he's just never grown up. And you get all these podcasts now by a few of the Jackass members who try to sort themselves out, or who have, fair play to them. But they're always like, oh, we care so much about Bam. But you're thinking, you were just dumb kids. And you're still kind of dumb kids now. The poor guy's soul is gone because he was so enraptured in the modern world and materialism and pleasure and nihilism. His soul is broken. The only thing that's going to save him now is God. It's that level with some people. It was that level with me, actually, as well. And many people will speak to that. But again, you won't get that in the mainstream church, unfortunately. But I hope you understand the picture I'm painting here. I'm not saying everybody was deeply embedded in this, but it was common, and everybody was touched by it to some extent. And of course, this translated into going to university with the same mindset as the culture we'd grown up in. It became about drugs, it became about nihilism, devil may care, rebelling against society. It became about the parties, getting drunk, getting laid. Your identity is very much rooted in how many girls you can get. Obviously, lust is an extraordinarily powerful force. Women are very beautiful. If you have no spiritual defenses, of course, you're going to try and hook up as much as you can, both male and female. Again, that leads to mass degeneracy down the line. But you don't know that when you're young. No one's ever told you the opposite. And if they've tried, they just seem like stern boomers who, in a way, have been detached from the spiritual light themselves. So it's very hard to transmit that spiritual wisdom. And again, this was really something this led to, this exploration of what on earth had gone on and why certain men were getting laid all the time. Either they're very confident, pushy, or good looking, or got loads of money. And a lot of men aren't. And this led to the 80-20 rule that the red pill picked up on. What's her name in the show Adolescence? The Andrew Tate shit, I think they call it. You can call it shit and try and pathologize it all they like. But it is true. And I've experienced both sides of it. I was a very lost young man who just couldn't work out modern life. So I know what it's like to be on the other side. I used to listen to the song People Are Strange by The Doors. And I really know it's really horrible when you're there and you can't fit into society. But, I did a lot of work on myself over a number of years and figured it out and figured out to talk to the chicky poos and learnt all the game techniques. And then I was on the other side and I realised this is wrong. This is freaking wrong, what's going on here. You think this idea that's given to young men, be the king and sleep with all the women and that defines your worth. And of course it's fun and pleasurable in the short term. But you don't realise it's corrupting your soul, it's corrupting the women who engage in it, and of course they do it willingly. They think it's great as well. They've been told by feminism it's great. But you also corrupt society. Families aren't being created. It breaks emotional bonds. It's harder to be loyal over the long run. Children aren't born, yada, yada. We all know what happens. And it leads to this mass decline over time. Now, I'm not saying all of this to judge people who are in that world, because I've been in it. I'm saying it to say it's extremely hard once you get stuck in it. And especially, like I say to my friends who are still in it, when you know the dark arts of how to talk to the ladies and you can have a new girlfriend every Friday night if you want, it's hard to say no to that, especially if you have no cultural and spiritual recourse. If families don't matter, if society doesn't matter, if it's a complete free-for-all about getting what you can get, then why would you turn against it? And especially if you don't have higher transcendent belief, it's extraordinarily hard. So again, it's almost like we need to treat these people like the prodigal son, in my mind, rather than judging them, because they'll just go back to their degeneracy. And the women, well, that's a whole other matter for another video, but they also need to come home. But again, they're lost in the grip of feminism. Men are evil, and best thing you can be is a corporate girl boss. We're only going to figure out that that's a dead end until we're totally swamped by Bamalians. But that's, of course, what the liberals will think. It doesn't matter if we don't recreate our own people, our own civilization, because we can just import infinity Bamalians. And what's wrong with you? Are you some racist? What's the matter? Do you hate them? All that sort of nonsense that they've been trained to think by the university system, which again is completely corrupted, by the way, by number one, the economic dimension. The idea is just get as many people as you can in and put them into debt. And they're already in debt from all the culture they've imbibed, But the point is, if it just becomes purely about the economic mechanism, you can just teach them any old nonsense. And this is why university has become relatively meaningless now. Someone has a PhD in cultural theory, it doesn't mean anything. A freaking monkey could do it. I'm not saying there aren't good PhDs in nuclear physics or whatever, and that still counts, but a lot of it is just nonsense now. It doesn't mean anything. So anyway, the point is that a lot of men, on the back of that, millennial men I'm talking about, started to think, well, how do I become someone? And they had two paths in front of them. You either basically buy into the liberal system, or you go against it and become the sort of alpha male bro. That becomes the mission. And that became something in the more latter years. It's more righteous coded. But it's the idea embodied in someone like Andrew Tate. I get all the women. Remember, he's extremely popular among young men, but he made his money by pimping out European women. And he's a hero to European men. It's a tragedy. I'm not saying Andrew Tate doesn't say the odd wise thing or has a better line on things than some of the liberals. At least he wakes some men up. But it bugs me how he's got this clear racial animus towards the Europeans and how he corrupts the true traditional message of manhood, which is really to be spiritually whole. And that doesn't come from having all the ladies and the money and showing off and being Billy Big Bollocks. It comes from giving your life to the higher transcendent order, which not only completes your life, but the sacred order of the whole as well. And with that comes the organization of the sacred order. This is why in the Christian tradition, marriage and family is at the very center of it. Because if you like, it contains the man and gives him his true role as leader. And with that gives the woman her true divine role as bearer of children and wise mother. And with that you create the greater social order where things are organised, where relationships are stable, where children grow up in firm environments and are spiritually protected by the heart of the father, who himself has pushed back against the temptations of the world. That's exactly what Aquinas said. It's effeminate if you want to go and sleep with all the chicky poos and have a load of pleasure around you. It's weak, but we interpret it through the sort of alpha male Andrew Tate thing as great and strong and tough. And of course, in our immediate understanding, it does seem like that. It does seem like that when you're 24 and all the ladies are there and you look good and you got your cologne on and your fancy shirt, or you're playing in your rock band and the girls like you. You feel good, you know. But it's all fool's gold. It breaks down the society. And as I always say, this is why you need to have a transcendent goal. Loyalty to religion, to God, to your people, and you'll build a strong society. If you don't have that, you have what we have now. Atomized, individual, self-centered, corrupt, declining. Another thing I've got to say that bugs me about this whole alpha male thing is there's nothing wrong with a strong man. There's nothing wrong with a man who's great in his given field, who's a leader, who rules. That's a wonderful thing. That's natural. We need that in hierarchy. It's part of sacred order. But what I don't like about it is the sort of crude supremacism that comes with a lot of this stuff. You know, getting the ladies and I'm all good and I'm the fucking best, toughest guy around here, bro. You want to go? That's not it. That's egoic. It's weak and egoic. You know, you might be physically strong, but what you're putting forth there is just egotism. You know, how you're better than everybody else. The true leader raises men up and takes them forward as the whole, you know. And again, this is why the ladies are being brainwashed as well, because a lot of them are going for these guys who've bought into the red pill, the alpha male stuff. And yeah, it will get you laid, that sort of thing. But then all these women come out and say, I thought he was great, but it turns out he's a psycho. But yeah, surprise, surprise. It's because they think in their wiring, you know, they've got to go for the top guy, the real leader, because they're drawn to that. The real male, the true embodied male. But it's a counterfeit that they get. And then, of course, it all ends in tears and blah, blah, blah. And we know the rest of it. So that's the one side that you get, which is, to be fair, at least better than the sort of softer side, which is the liberal side, where they just try and reject masculinity wholesale. And we've all seen this. This is toxic masculinity, where, again, there's some high value in there somewhere that they're talking to about, you know, being crude and morally base and the rest of it. But they almost go so far with it, they destroy noble masculine qualities like confidence and assertiveness and even integrated aggression and all these sorts of positive things that men need. But they just want to get rid of it wholesale because, in a sense, they're scared of it themselves. They've never been initiated into it themselves. And they have this sort of pseudo-spirituality around it as well. You know, about, oh, it's just about overcoming your own hate and your own ego. And again, there's some truth in there that's noble. But as always, they throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it becomes this sort of Western liberal luxury belief, this idea that, you know, oh, we don't need toxic masculinity, and the whole ideas of being part of a people and a man and a tribe, all of this just needs to go because it's all just your own illusory hate. What they don't realize, of course, is that's a Western luxury belief. And everybody else in the world still thinks that way because it's fundamental to being human. It has a dark side, sure, but it also has a light side. And that's what we've forgotten in the Western world, or at least millennials have. And this, again, this is where the famous snowflake comes from, of course. You know, and it's easy to mock the snowflake in this day and age. Many of us do and have. But I think we forget that, you know, again, we should have a bit of compassion for the snowflake because these have been brainwashed, these people, but worse than that, they've grown up in an environment where they've been traumatized. They've had no fatherly guidance. They've taken lots of drugs a lot of the time. They've been involved in a society which is deeply unstable. There's no broad social agreement across the track which gives us a sort of socio-cultural basis upon which to structure our psychology. All of that's gone, you know. I see that with my grandma, a 96 Yorkshire woman. It's why I like talking to her. She's not the brightest woman in the world. She's not stupid, but she's you can just tell she's riffing on an original basis which is strong. And when you talk to her, it's like you're talking to England. You know, it's a wonderful thing. Anyway, the point is that you have to remember these people didn't grow up with any of that. And even if they did see it, they think it's toxic and disgusting because they've been so brainwashed. And when the boomers try and help these people, you know, they just tell them that pull your socks up, these sorts of things. Go and get a job. Go into the world of work, which again is just another materialist dimension. It's not to say that, you know, there aren't good values there in working hard, but the idea that just going into the market is going to save them and solve them, it's just not going to happen. The reality is that so many millennials are realizing now is that they're on their own. And life is full of trapdoors, yet modern life has lovely trinkets and conveniences. But its structure underneath that, its spiritual structure, is non-existent. You know, and if you make a wrong step, you can step on a landmine and you might not come back. And that's happened to many people. And the only way back from it is, you know, therapy. And some therapy can help a lot of the time, but again, it's very spiritually feminine. It's poor you, it's tell me your story, it's you're the victim. Which again, in certain circumstances, that can work, but only very unique ones, and normally for women more than men. Which is why many men now are reaching back to their roots in religion. How can I find guidance? Where can my soul rest? How can I become a better man? But as I say many times, they go to church, they find a lesbian with a bowl haircut lecturing them about how great gay people are, or how they should, be pro-mass immigration and think about illegals coming in and be pro all of that and give their money to that, and that makes them a good person. Just more nonsense. They're not learning anything about what it means to be a man, to go through hell, to battle the deep, dark spiritual forces of life. They don't get any of that. They're just told all of that's nonsense. And their fathers, of course, are at their job or have retired and are now living the life of the liberal boomer. It reminds me, actually, when I was finding myself in my late 20s hitting up against the wall. It's a completely absurd thing to reference here, but it sums up the state of modernity. I remember listening to that song, Gangster's Paradise by Coolio. You must say, what on earth has a ghetto black guy got in common with a lost middle class guy in England? But that lyric in there said something like, they say I've got to learn, but nobody's here to teach me. If they can't understand it, how can they reach me? I guess they can't. I guess they won't. I guess they front. That's why I know my life is out of luck. And I remember listening to that thinking, God, that really speaks to me. Because everywhere I turn, there's just no help that's deep enough to reach me. And a lot of people don't even understand what I'm talking about. Now, again, I was extraordinarily lucky, because I started to realise that pig that I saw at the beginning of the video I was talking about when I was like 23, covered in mustard and mayonnaise and tomato ketchup and masturbating with a pig head, that meant it was the soul of the millennial that was being enforced on the individual by Western culture. And so many of us have been locked in that almost hellish vision and haven't even known it. Again, we sort of comatose ourselves with the media of modernity, the alcohol, the weed, whatever else it is, the sex, the promise of sex, the pornography, the promise of one day it will all make sense, the liberal ideology. It all blocks us from that dark soul. And in many ways, I was very lucky to hit the wall at 100 miles an hour in my late 20s and everything go crash and really kind of be broken apart to the very extent where I had to admit, I just don't know anything. I really don't have a clue. And that was God breaking me apart. And as I say, luckily I didn't take drugs or run away from it. I had to go through some hard times. But you realise the stillness within is the way. And this is the thing that really showed me what all of this culture that I come from meant. God is a father for a reason, because he's your real father, your spiritual father. And I've got to say, the peace that gave me, that realisation inside, I think, I'm starting to get it now. Life itself is God. And if I let go of my mind and my own ideas, there is a freedom. No one was going to tell me that in the church. I had to dive deeply into mysticism and meet the biggest weirdos you've ever come across. Sit through 4-hour lectures full of, weirdo lefties who like to have careers in hemp, with dreadlocks. And I was like, I'm getting it now. I'm starting to understand. It's all my mind. I've been lost in modernity, lost in this hell. And you come out of it and you think, I'm starting to get what the true Christian message is. This is, again, why Christ says, I've come to bring a sword. I'll split brother from brother and father from son. Dawkins would have a field day with that, of course, as you can imagine. But what he's really saying is, with the true realization, you'll realize human bonds are nothing compared to the spiritual bond. And far from making me distant from my father, Christ is talking in a metaphor, of course, when he talks about bringing a sword, it made me close with my father and my parents and even the boomer generation, because you realize they're just lost too. They don't know what they were doing either. They've had this same brainwashing too. They're just a little further down the road than I am, or a little less affected by it. And I've got to say, through that realization, the closeness that allowed me to gain with my father, which again is spiritually healing. Sons need their fathers. It's not just a biological relationship. But anyway, by 30, I was like, I'm starting to get this now. And God, the peace, and you feel like a person at last, it's wonderful. But again, then you look at the society and think, God, no wonder why we're so broken. And no wonder why people turn to these ideologies and drugs and booze and everything else that can complete them, sleeping with the chicky poos, anything that can stop us from the true realization. It's when you get it's a real dark forces in life, are really at play there, and you see it. And we're hidden from it in our modern life. We really are. We are basically hypnotized away from realizing what's going on our soul level. When I used to go and see my brother in the psychiatric units, you realize they know what's going on. We think they're all mad, and they are mad, to be fair, but they're crying for Jesus, a lot of them. It's really hard to watch when you're walking through and hearing some of these sounds. It's like the sounds of hell, And then some, cold, brutal Nigerian nurse comes in to subdue them before the lab coat professor who runs around once every fortnight, gives them another load of comatosing drugs. I'm not saying they're not right to do that. It might be the only thing you can do at one level. But you think these are spiritual problems, and you see it when you're there. That's why I believe, the problems we face in modernity cannot be remedied by science, but it's the only way we look at the world now. Everything's reason and logic. There are deeper forces at play here, and our tradition once protected us and showed us the way. But again, you think now with Generation Z, in some senses you can see they do seem to be waking up to some of these things, or at least subconsciously. But again, modernity, the dark forces have ramped everything up again. Drugs are more present. Hookup culture is more present. In the coaching work I used to do before this, I used to speak to some guys who were in their early to mid-20s. They'd slept with 100 women by the time they were 22, some of them. It's unreal. And the women too. I mean, it's crazy what's happened with hookup culture. Porn is everywhere now, absolutely everywhere, which is a spiritual weapon. And of course, woke ideology has come in. That's a big one to try and bring our youngsters, or basically brainwash them for a number of decades into the will and whims of the system. And this again, it leads to this endless culture of critique. That's what I grew up with, really. This is the sort of post-Frankfurt School stuff. Everything must be critiqued. And the promise is liberation, but what it really delivers is nihilism and despair. And until we realise, the truth of our tradition, we're just never going to be able to push back. We're only going to be able to survive by, self-comatosing Premier League football, booze and YouTube videos, or the liberal ideology, as I say. And what even is a success these days anyway? I mean, think about it, it's Gary Neville, isn't it? By some hook or crook, you make millions. You become extremely rich by talent or extreme luck. Probably a bit of both in Neville's case. And then you live the life of a Thatcherite while lecturing everyone as if you're a Corbynite. That's success now. It's spiritually dead and it's incoherent. Oh, what's his name? Big John. You've probably seen this guy. He goes and eats all the cakes and the Chinese food and all that. Why is this guy famous? It's really sad because he's got a son who's a boxer. Being a father to a boxer is a noble role. You know what I mean? That's a great thing for a man to do. But instead, he's got this fame by eating copious amounts of Chinese food, which plays into the modern degeneracy. Mass consumption, as if it's some virtuous mission, as if it's funny. And then saying your catchphrase after. And then apparently now he's being used by the liberal system to sort of promote, international slop as to why mass immigration is a good thing. But again, it's all just modernity. Everything's corrupted. It's meaningless. And modernity itself, it's a comatosing tool, as I say, blocking us from spiritual realization. But the problem is, the very way we're being destroyed is where the exact hope is, because the wall of tradition, the spiritual defense which once protected us, that our ancestors built, has been taken down brick by brick. And every time we take down a brick, a demon comes out, a ghoul comes out, and it will take some people back to hell with it, whether that's in the form of drugs or corruption through sex or whatever it is. But it's still, at the moment, just not broken down enough for us to stay comatose. But eventually the whole thing is going to fall, and then it will really be business time. We will see why our ancestors built that wall of tradition and what it represented. And we have to now. We have to see life as it truly is. And when that happens, again, that's when chaos comes out. It's when Pandora's boxes open, the gates of hell are revealed. Then you understand why we needed order, But very often, and it's a spiritual truism, it's part of the cyclic nature of history, the part of the cyclic nature of man's evolution. You do have to face hell. Christ had to face hell. He had to stand and face the devil. And the devil tried to tempt him with everything. And Christ stood with the stillness of being, the loyalty of God, and could overcome. That's our measure. It's not going to be easy, but it's ultimately what Western man has to go through if he is going to find himself. That's the meaning of what was once at the centre of Western culture, the cross. The material world will rip you to shreds, beat you up, and leave you for dead. But you can overcome it because there's something in you which is greater. That's the transcendent spirit, And that's even in the midst of hell, there is deep hope. There is transcendence. That's the true message of the cross. And again, it's something I find deeply moving, especially about Christianity. Is you think about this metaphor in quantum physics from this guy Walter Heisenberg. The first sip of the natural sciences makes you an atheist, but when you get to the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. It's the same with all the darkness of the world, in my view. When you see the true brutality of life, you think, how can there be a loving God when there's this hell here? It's pure hell, and it puts you off and you think, no way. But the more you see of it, the worse it gets. You start to realize our order is there. Truth is there at the bottom of it all. And it's us that are turned away from it, not it turning away from us. And again, as I say, in my mind, that is the return of sacred order, which once backed up the West, which backs up any tradition. It's the transmission of the great sacred order, the spiritual truths that give us completion in our own soul, but also for our civilization. It's not from the mind. It's not from a test tube or by looking through some binoculars or whatever else. It's not from ideas. It's not from philosophers. It comes from the very core of life itself. And we only realize that when we go through the hard times and our pride is gone, our intellectual ego is gone, and we see the truth there, shining plain. God is real. And until we turn back to that, we will continue wandering in the darkness. But hope is always there, friends, and that very much is the mission for me on the sister channel, The Sacred Way, all about personal and spiritual transformation. Do check it out if you're interested. Also, do join the Substack if you like. There's all sort of exclusive content there, and you can join the monthly chats. Do come along to those if you're interested. And if you just want to support me and my mission as well to further this message. Do enjoy the rest of your day, fellas, and take good care of yourselves.